The first report arrived at 6:40. A Marine guard at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow claimed he had heard a faint metallic click behind the embassy's third-floor ventilation panel, too soft for a mechanical fault, too deliberate for an accident. By 7:15, the station chief had the building locked down. Lights dimmed, elevators halted. And every American inside the compound was quietly instructed to remain at their desks. But nobody, not the Marines, not the CIA tech unit, not even the senior case officers, suspected that the source of the breach had already vanished into the morning snow. For months, whispers of an invisible intruder had disturbed the embassy. Typewriters emitting signals when unplugged, phones humming with unexplained harmonics, entire rooms where the acoustic signature felt wrong. Some blamed aging systems. Others suspected KGB harassment. The truth was far worse. An unknown infiltrator had been planting microtransmitters inside the mission for nearly a year, each device undetectable by standard sweeps and placed with surgical precision. At 8:10, the station chief reviewed grainy footage from the previous night. Most cameras had blind spots, some suspiciously recent. Yet one fragment caught his attention. A janitor pushing a cleaning cart past the restricted communications office. Nothing strange except for one detail: the man's reflection did not match his body position. He moved with the muscle memory of someone trained to be unnoticed. The embassy assumed all Russian maintenance staff were vetted by Soviet authorities. But what if one of them wasn't just a janitor? What if he had been inserted, groomed, and positioned by Directorate T, the KGB's technical directorate responsible for some of the most advanced infiltration programs ever attempted? At 9:02, investigators opened the ventilation panel. Behind it, embedded like a parasite in the metal ribbing, was a wafer-thin device, no larger than a coin. It held a frequency crystal calibrated to relay diplomatic conversations to an off-site receiver somewhere in Moscow's diplomatic quarter. The craftsmanship was unmistakably Soviet, but the placement, the knowledge of exactly where the Americans would never look, hinted at something more. An insider with nightly access and an understanding of American technical blind spots. The station chief issued a single directive: find the ghost. But the ghost, they would soon learn, had been inside the embassy for years, sweeping floors, emptying trash, polishing brass fixtures while quietly turning one of the most secure American outposts in the world into a glass house for the KGB. He was invisible because nobody ever looks at the janitor. The Americans began with the personnel list: 63 Soviet nationals, assigned as cleaners, electricians, furnace operators, and night shift custodians. All were cleared by the Soviet Foreign Ministry. All had passed routine American background checks. And all, on paper, were painfully ordinary. But one name stood out to the station chief the moment he saw it: Alexei Morozov, age 53, janitor, assigned to the U.S. mission for 11 years, never late, never absent, never disciplined. A man without complaints, ambitions, or notable habits. The kind of worker every embassy wants, precisely because nobody remembers him. To the CIA tech officers, this was the first red flag. 11 years inside a hostile nation embassy was not a posting, it was a surveillance dream. As they pulled Morozov's file, patterns began emerging. He worked the overnight rotation where guard patrols were lightest. He handled maintenance in high-value areas: comms, storage, archive hallways. His routes traced the exact vectors where the Americans later discovered hidden cavities, ideal for transmitting or concealing micro-devices. Still, no one wanted to believe a janitor could outsmart them. CIA Moscow station prided itself on counterintelligence discipline. But pride is exactly what the KGB counted on. By noon, the investigators discovered something worse. The cleaning cart Morozov used was not assigned to any other worker. It was always locked, always with him, and always stored in an obscure basement closet that Americans rarely entered. When CIA officers inspected it, nothing seemed unusual: mop, solvents, rags, dusters. but the cart weighed too much for its contents. Tech officers quietly removed the bottom panel. Beneath it lay a false compartment lined with soft insulation designed to shield magnetic signatures. Empty now, but clearly used. Alexei Morozov wasn't stealing embassy supplies. He was ferrying equipment in and out. When they replayed surveillance footage, a disturbing pattern emerged. Morozov often paused in front of diplomatic offices, standing motionless with his mop while the Americans spoke inside. Most dismissed him as background noise. But the KGB trained listeners with extraordinary skill, men taught to remember tone, rhythm, arrangement of voices. Morozov didn't need microphones in some rooms. He was the microphone. The station chief ordered discreet shadowing. 2 Marines followed Morozov during his shift. They reported nothing unusual at first. He moved slowly, almost lazily, sweeping corridor after corridor, pausing only to wipe down brass rails. But at 1746, something changed. Morozov stopped outside the communications office and tilted his head just slightly as if listening for a code. Then, with the smoothness of a man opening a familiar lock, he slid a tool no bigger than a pencil through the ventilation grate. The Marines, watching from 20 meters away, saw only a minor adjustment, but the CIA tech officer monitoring the feed froze. Morozov wasn't cleaning. He was calibrating their bug. The janitor had become the Americans' most intimate threat. Someone who navigated blind spots, moved between conversations unnoticed, and blended into the architecture like wallpaper. But the real question, the one that haunted the station chief, was this. If Morozov had been planting devices for over a decade, what had the KGB already heard? The CIA's counterintelligence team needed hard proof. Suspicion wasn't enough, not in Moscow, where every accusation could trigger diplomatic retaliation. If they were wrong, the Soviets would accuse Washington of harassing local workers. If they were right, the damage was already catastrophic. A full sweep of the embassy began at 22:05, carried out under the guise of a fire safety inspection. Every vent, panel, floorboard, and conduit was examined with spectrum analyzers and thermal probes. By 23:40, the team had found 3 more devices, one embedded in a light switch housing, another inside an air duct, and a third hidden behind a wall-mounted map that hadn't been moved since the Carter administration. But then came the most damning discovery. Behind a file cabinet in the political section, an officer spotted a faint seam along the baseboard molding. When they removed the wood panel, they uncovered a narrow cavity lined with copper mesh, an improvised Faraday sleeve. Inside it lay a miniature Soviet-designed passive resonator, tuned to the exact vocal frequencies used in the embassy's secure discussions. A resonator that didn't transmit. It waited and stored. The KGB hadn't just listened, they had been recording. The implications were staggering. A passive device meant someone had to physically retrieve the recordings. No remote interception, no long-range siphoning. Someone had been entering the embassy repeatedly, undetected, collecting the intelligence cache and resetting the device. Only one person had nightly access, unrestricted movement, and a legitimate reason to be near every room. Alexei Morozov. But even this revelation raised a deeper question. Who built the cavity? The construction required hours of uninterrupted access. Americans would have noticed, unless the modifications were made before the embassy staff moved in. That meant the KGB had anticipated every defensive measure, every security sweep, every American assumption about safe spaces. This wasn't just an infiltration, it was architecture-level espionage. As the sweep continued, a chilling pattern emerged. The bug placements mapped perfectly onto the KGB's long-range intelligence priorities: negotiations, encryption updates, diplomatic cables, assessment meetings. It was as if someone on the inside knew exactly which conversations mattered most. But Morozov wasn't just a janitor with access. His movements, captured on fragmented surveillance footage, revealed subtle behaviors, the way he timed his shifts around high-level discussions, how he positioned his cleaning cart to obstruct corridor cameras, how he placed himself near doors at moments when acoustic leakage would be greatest. He wasn't reacting to embassy routines. He was anticipating them. At 1:12, the station chief gathered his senior officers in a secure room. "Our building," he said quietly, "was never ours." A silence fell over the room, thick, cold, metallic. If the KGB had been listening for over a decade, the Americans had to assume that every negotiation, every contingency plan, every courier schedule, every cryptographic update had been compromised. Their mission had been transparent to Moscow Center, and at the heart of it all was a soft-spoken janitor who never spoke unless spoken to. A ghost dressed in overalls. A man who had silently rewritten the balance of power inside the most surveilled building in the Soviet Union. By dawn, CIA Moscow station had reached an uncomfortable consensus. Morozov was not merely a janitor recruited by the KGB. His precision, his technical fluency, and his ability to avoid every established countermeasure suggested a far more dangerous pedigree. They pulled older Soviet personnel files, ones the Americans had once considered irrelevant. Those files revealed a pattern the KGB had hoped no one would ever notice. In the early 1972nd, before being assigned to janitorial duty, Alexei Morozov had served 8 years as a technician for Department 12, a subdivision of Directorate T responsible for covert audio engineering and clandestine installations. Department 12 was infamous inside intelligence circles. They didn't train agents to steal documents, they trained ghosts to rewrite reality. They taught their men to disappear into walls, ceilings, and service corridors. They trained them to build devices that blended into the architecture itself. Morozov wasn't a KGB recruit. He was a KGB asset from birth. His transfer to janitorial work wasn't a demotion. It was a deployment. The Americans now understood the real brilliance of the operation. Morozov's entire presence was designed to lower suspicion. A man who kept his eyes down, never asked questions, and carried a mop instead of a briefcase. A man no diplomat would fear, no guard would challenge, no surveillance plan would prioritize. But his file held one more detail, buried in the bureaucratic dust of Soviet personnel jargon. Temporary reassignment conditioned on operational requirements. The phrase meant only one thing: Morozov had been placed in the embassy with a long-term mission, one potentially spanning decades. At 9:50, the CIA tech team located a flaw in the embassy's ventilation schematics. A section of ductwork near the ambassador's office had dimensional irregularities, a half-inch variance that made no architectural sense. When they drilled a microhole and inserted a fiber optic probe, they found what every intelligence officer dreads: a concealed crawl space. A space only a small, flexible, disciplined operator could enter. A space the Americans never knew existed. Inside that crawl space were discarded fragments. Solder flecks, a tiny spool of copper wire, insulation fibers matching Morozov's cleaning cart compartment lining, and a scrap of cloth, worn thin, smelling faintly of chemical solvent. The station chief stared at the probe footage. "Good God," he muttered, "has been building a workshop inside our embassy." By afternoon, pressure mounted from Washington. The infiltration was too extensive to conceal. Langley demanded answers. How long had the KGB been inside? What intelligence had they stolen? And most urgently, was Morozov still active? But the Soviets had moved faster than anyone expected. At 16:15, when the embassy attempted to discreetly summon Morozov for questioning, they discovered his apartment had been emptied overnight. Neighbors reported seeing a black Volga sedan outside at 4:20. 2 men escorted Morozov out. They carried no luggage. They spoke to no one. They vanished into the city before sunrise. The Americans were horrified not because he escaped, but because the KGB had extracted him before the Americans even realized he was missing. Watching from Moscow Center, Someone had anticipated the CIA's panic, the sweep, the inevitable suspicion. They pulled their asset with mathematical precision, likely minutes after the Americans found the first device. That timing meant only one thing. Morozov had a handler inside the embassy's line of sight. Someone watching the watchers. The janitor may have been the ghost, but the ghost did not work alone. By dawn, CIA Moscow station had reached an uncomfortable consensus. Morozov was not merely a janitor recruited by the KGB. His precision, his technical fluency, and his ability to avoid every established countermeasure suggested a far more dangerous pedigree. They pulled older Soviet personnel files, ones the Americans had once considered irrelevant. Those files revealed a pattern the KGB had hoped no one would ever notice. In the early 1970s, before being assigned to janitorial duty, Alexei Morozov had served 8 years as a technician for Department 12, a subdivision of Directorate T responsible for covert audio engineering and clandestine installations. Department 12 was infamous inside intelligence circles. They didn't train agents to steal documents, they trained ghosts to rewrite reality. They taught their men to disappear into walls, ceilings, and service corridors. They trained them to build devices that blended into the architecture itself. Morozov wasn't a KGB recruit. He was a KGB asset from birth. His transfer to janitorial work wasn't a demotion. It was a deployment. The Americans now understood the real brilliance of the operation. Morozov's entire presence was designed to lower suspicion. A man who kept his eyes down, never asked questions, and carried a mop instead of a briefcase. A man no diplomat would fear, no guard would challenge, no surveillance plan would prioritize. But his file held one more detail, buried in the bureaucratic dust of Soviet personnel jargon. Temporary reassignment conditioned on operational requirements. The phrase meant only one thing: Morozov had been placed in the embassy with a long-term mission, one potentially spanning decades. At 9:50, the CIA tech team located a flaw in the embassy's ventilation schematics. A section of ductwork near the ambassador's office had dimensional irregularities, a half-inch variance that made no architectural sense. When they drilled a microhole and inserted a fiber optic probe, they found what every intelligence officer dreads: a concealed crawl space. A space only a small, flexible, disciplined operator could enter. A space the Americans never knew existed. Inside that crawl space were discarded fragments, solder flecks, a tiny spool of copper wire, insulation fibers matching Morozov's, cleaning cart compartment lining, and a scrap of cloth, worn thin, smelling faintly of chemical solvent. The station chief stared at the probe footage. "Good God," he muttered, "has been building a workshop inside our embassy." By afternoon, pressure mounted from Washington. The infiltration was too extensive to conceal. Langley demanded answers. How long had the KGB been inside? What intelligence had they stolen? And most urgently, was Morozov still active? But the Soviets had moved faster than anyone expected. At 16:15, when the embassy attempted to discreetly summon Morozov for questioning, they discovered his apartment had been emptied overnight. Neighbors reported seeing a black Volga sedan outside at 4:20. 2 men escorted Morozov out. They carried no luggage. They spoke to no one. They vanished into the city before sunrise. The Americans were horrified not because he escaped, but because the KGB had extracted him before the Americans even realized he was missing. Watching from Moscow Center, someone had anticipated the CIA's panic, the sweep, the inevitable suspicion. They pulled their asset with mathematical precision, likely minutes after the Americans found the first device. That timing meant only one thing. Morozov had a handler inside the embassy's line of sight, someone watching the watchers. The janitor may have been the ghost, but the ghost did not work alone. The discovery of Morozov's extraction detonated through the embassy like a silent explosion. If the KGB had pulled him before dawn, they had either intercepted American communications or someone inside the building had signaled that the operation had been compromised. For the first time, the station chief considered a possibility he had spent his entire career rejecting. There might be a second infiltrator, not a janitor, not a technician, someone far higher. Langley dispatched immediate instructions. Conduct a silent internal audit of all embassy personnel, American and Soviet. No interviews. No alerts. Just data. The CIA analysts began comparing shift logs, access badges, guard rotations, phone records, and security anomalies. And then, a name surfaced, not a KGB asset, but an American. A mid-level communications specialist named Daniel Rourke, 38 years old. Clean file. No disciplinary issues. But his digital footprint, once reconstructed, revealed troubling anomalies. His badge had registered access to areas he had no operational reason to enter: mechanical rooms, vent shafts, storage corridors adjacent to Morozov's cleaning routes. At first glance, these incidents seemed like simple badge errors. But the timestamps told a darker story. Every suspicious entry coincided with moments when Morozov was unaccounted for on camera. Rourke wasn't helping Morozov plant devices. He was helping him avoid detection. CIA counterintelligence cross-referenced travel records. Rourke had taken 3 unexplained day trips to Leningrad. He had no relatives there, no stated business, no embassy authorization. But Leningrad was home to a notorious Directorate K safehouse cluster, a perfect location for clandestine meetings with foreign assets. Still, none of this was definitive proof. Spies were caught through behavior, not conjecture. The station chief ordered a contact trace, a deep analysis of Rourke's last 18 months of activity. The results were devastating. Rourke's off-duty movements overlapped repeatedly with KGB surveillance zones, places Americans were warned to avoid, parks with known watchers, cafes with controlled staff, transit hubs where encounters looked accidental but weren't. One pattern stood out. Every 2 weeks, Rourke stopped at a tiny kiosk near the riverbank, supposedly to buy cigarettes. Except Rourke didn't smoke. The kiosk owner, when discreetly profiled, was identified as a low-level informant for the KGB's counterintelligence service. The pieces snapped together like a steel trap. Morozov was the infiltrator. Rourke was the facilitator, an unwitting asset, carefully groomed. The KGB's methods were legendary. Find a man with vulnerabilities, financial strain, loneliness, professional stagnation, then build rapport, offer help, offer friendship, until he's delivering microseconds of access that change the strategic balance between 2 superpowers. Their relationship wasn't ideological. It was psychological engineering. When the CIA monitored Rourke on the following evening, the truth became undeniable. At exactly 26, he walked to the embassy's east stairwell and stopped at the landing between floors. He stood still for 6 seconds, too still. And then he placed something the size of a coin behind the fire hose cabinet. A signal marker, a message to Moscow Center. Morozov, compromised. Extraction complete. The station chief watched the surveillance replay twice in silence. There was no rage, only a cold clarity. Morozov hadn't vanished because he was clever. He vanished because someone inside the U.S. embassy told the KGB exactly when to take him. The janitor was the ghost. Rourke was the shadow cast by the ghost. But the Americans still didn't know the full scope of damage or the final layer of the KGB's plan. That revelation was waiting in a place nobody had thought to check. Not a vent, not a crawl space, not a hidden cavity, but the embassy's own secure communications vault. The embassy's secure communications vault, known simply as the Vault, was the one place no Soviet national was ever allowed to enter. Not janitors, not technicians, not delivery staff. Even American personnel required dual authorization and a clearance level higher than most CIA case officers ever reached. If the KGB had penetrated that room, The implications would be apocalyptic. The Americans entered the vault at 3:15 under full lockdown. 2 Marines guarded the outer corridor while the CIA tech unit dismantled every panel, junction box, cable sheath, and acoustic tile. At first, nothing appeared compromised. The vault was reinforced steel, insulated with sound-attenuating foam, and ringed with anti-tamper sensors. But one senior technician, an old hand who had served in Saigon, Berlin, and Ankara, noticed something others missed. In the upper corner of the vault, a small metal plate was secured, with screws that did not match the original manufacturer's pattern. The screws were Soviet-made, just a fraction shorter, with a beveled edge found only in Eastern Bloc hardware. That meant someone had accessed the vault's structural casing, and only one person had the physical agility, silence, and technical expertise to do it. Alexei Morozov. The plate was removed slowly, carefully. Behind it was not a device, but a tunnel of sorts, a narrow, hand-carved aperture descending into the wall cavity. The Americans lowered a fiber optic scope. The screen revealed the impossible. The vault's electromagnetic shielding had been breached from the outside. Morozov had scraped away sections of the copper Faraday mesh, replacing them with his own conductive lattice. To the naked eye, the vault looked intact. But to a sophisticated Soviet receiver tuned to the right harmonics, the shielding behaved differently. It leaked micro-variations in current when the Americans transmitted encrypted messages. In other words, every time the embassy sent a classified communication, the KGB heard a faint echo. Not the message itself yet, but the structure of its encryption, the pulse signatures, the timing intervals. This data could allow Soviet cryptanalysts to rebuild entire cipher systems from scratch. The station chief stared at the analysis results with a hollow expression. "We've been broadcasting our playbook to Moscow Center," he whispered. But there was more. Far deeper inside the cavity, past the shielding breach, past the carved opening, was a metal bracket holding something that made the entire team fall silent. A tool. A simple, mundane tool. One that could only belong to someone who worked in the building every day. A pressed steel keyring, embossed with the U.S. Missions Inventory seal. Morozov had not worked alone inside the vault. Someone with American clearance had given him the access key. Not Rourke, the comm specialist, didn't have vault-level clearance. That meant the KGB had compromised a second American. Someone higher, someone trusted, someone who could enter the vault without raising suspicion. A new name emerged from the clearance logs, someone who had entered the vault 12 times in the last 6 months. Always during night hours. Always when Morozov was on shift nearby. Deputy Systems Officer Mark Ellery. A man whose job was to maintain communications integrity. A man who had unknowingly destroyed it. But as the Americans prepared to detain Ellery, they discovered a final twist. Ellery was missing. His apartment door was open. His coat was gone. His passport was missing. And on his kitchen table sat a single matchbox, the old Soviet kind. Inside was a slip of paper with a handwritten message. "You were looking in the wrong direction." The CIA team stared at the note, realizing the horror. Morozov wasn't the center of the operation. He was the decoy. The true architect of the embassy breach had never worn janitor's clothes. For weeks, the Americans had believed the KGB's infiltration revolved around a single figure, the quiet janitor who swept floors but planted microphones in the walls. But the matchbox message left in Mark Ellery's apartment shattered that illusion completely. "You were looking in the wrong direction." This was not the taunt of a panicked man on the run. It was the signature of an operator who believed he was still in control. The CIA re-examined Ellery's life with fresh eyes. He had no financial troubles, no ideological ties, no suspicious travel. He lived simply, kept to himself, and had a record of excellence in both field operations and technical training. In Cold War logic, that profile didn't exonerate him, it made him more dangerous. But the real breakthrough came from a detail so small most analysts had missed it. Ellery's clearance had been upgraded 18 months earlier after he volunteered for additional training at Langley. The program was standard cryptographic systems, vault maintenance protocols, emergency communication lines. Thousands of officers cycled through it. Except Ellery wasn't one of those officers. He had never actually attended. He had flown to the United States. Yes. He had stayed in government lodging. Yes. But evidence now showed that for 4 consecutive days during the training window, Ellery's whereabouts were unaccounted for. He didn't check into the training facility. He didn't meet his instructors. He didn't visit colleagues. His movements were a blank. On the 5th day, he reappeared at the facility, signed a few forms, and returned to Moscow as scheduled, armed with the certifications he never earned. If he wasn't attending CIA training, what was he doing? The answer emerged from a faint clue hidden in Soviet border logs. A passenger manifest listed a flight from Washington to Montreal on the exact day Ellery disappeared. One additional passenger boarded mid-transfer with no customs record, using a passport belonging to a U.S. federal employee. The photo on that fake passport was Ellery. Someone had intercepted him on American soil. Someone had met with him, briefed him, trained him, and returned him, all without Langley noticing. This wasn't a recruitment. This was an activation. By the time Ellery returned to Moscow, he already possessed the knowledge Morozov needed to breach the vault. He understood shielding weaknesses, electromagnetic bleed pathways, and the vulnerabilities of the embassy's oldest encryption modules. He knew exactly where to carve, where to cut, where to bypass sensors. Morozov was there to perform precision work. Rourke was there to shield Morozov's movements. But Ellery? Ellery was the mind behind it all. The Americans discovered his final masterstroke at 2:30, when a tech officer noticed a discrepancy in the embassy's power architecture. A low, steady drain, undetectable to the naked eye, was being siphoned through a maintenance conduit in the basement. When they followed the line to its endpoint, they found a tiny device wired into the building's power grid. Not a transmitter, not a recorder, a relay switch. At random intervals, the switch rerouted power away from the vault's anti-tamper array, creating momentary blind windows lasting less than 0.2 of a second. Too brief for any human eye to catch. But for a man like Morozov, who had spent decades turning seconds into opportunities, it was more than enough. The KGB's operation had 3 layers. Morozov the hands, Rourke the access, Ellery the architect. A perfect triangle of compromises, engineered so that no single point could be linked without discovering the others. At 4, a CIA task force combed through Moscow, looking for Ellery's safe houses, metro routes, dead drop zones. But he had vanished as if he had never existed. His disappearance was too clean, too practiced. He hadn't fled the city. He had been extracted. And then came the report that chilled the entire embassy staff. A Soviet military helicopter had departed a restricted airfield outside Moscow at 5:12, heading north toward the White Sea. On board were several unidentified passengers, escorted by KGB officers from the elite Second Chief Directorate. One of the passengers matched Ellery's height and build. The Americans had lost the architect, but the operation wasn't over. Because inside the embassy was one final device they hadn't yet found. A device Ellery had built with his own hands. A device Morozov had calibrated. A device Rourke had helped conceal. And this one wasn't designed to listen. It was designed to activate. The Americans found the last device by accident. At 6:47, a junior technician restarted the embassy's backup generator to stabilize the power grid after hours of sweeping and rewiring. When the generator surged, a faint harmonic frequency rippled through the building, high enough to be inaudible, low enough to vibrate in the steel framing. A sensor on the 3rd floor flickered. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the embassy's entire structural diagnostic system lit up like a Christmas tree. Something was waking up, something embedded deep inside the walls. The station chief sprinted to the tech room, arriving as the analysts isolated the anomaly. The device was concealed behind a reinforced column adjacent to the ambassador's office, an area previously assumed impenetrable. When they opened the panel, they found what looked at first like a primitive capacitor rig. It was nothing of the sort. The engineers who dissected it fell silent as they realized what Ellery had built. It was a resonance amplifier, a Soviet-designed relay engineered to piggyback on the embassy's own electrical hum. When activated, it wouldn't transmit or record. Instead, it would subtly distort electromagnetic signatures across multiple internal systems: keypads, encryption modules, door sensors, fire suppression relays, even the embassy's secure line scramblers. In short, it could blind the embassy from the inside for exactly 9 minutes. 9 minutes where alarms wouldn't register, where cameras would capture only static, where encrypted systems would output corrupted nonsense, where every layer of American counterintelligence would be deaf, blind, and useless. Why 9 minutes? One technician asked, voice shaking. The station chief already knew the answer. 9 minutes was long enough for a hit team to breach the compound. 9 minutes was long enough to extract a high-value target. 9 minutes was long enough for a false flag incident to be staged. 9 minutes was long enough to rewrite the Cold War in blood. Morozov hadn't been planting microphones. He had been preparing a surgical entry corridor. Rourke wasn't just signaling extractions. He was mapping the embassy's blind spots. And Ellery, the architect, had been designing a kill switch. But there was another possibility, far more chilling. The device might not have been intended for an attack at all. It could have been a deniable window for diplomacy, a concealed gap the Soviets could activate whenever they needed to know whether Washington was preparing something it didn't want Moscow to know, a means of leveling the playing field in a city where neither side trusted the other's intentions for more than a breath, a silent equilibrium, maintained by a secret neither superpower could ever acknowledge. As the Americans dismantled the resonance amplifier, the truth settled on the station chief like dust. This was never about espionage, he said quietly. This was about control. Because the greatest power in the Cold War belonged not to those who listened, but to those who could decide when others could not speak. The Americans filed their reports. The embassy replaced its systems. Washington issued diplomatic protests that Moscow denied with a smile. Life returned to something resembling normal. But deep inside the old embassy walls, in spaces only ghosts had ever entered, faint marks remained: scratches in the steel, cut lines in the copper mesh, fingerprints smudged by solvent. The legacy of a janitor, a shadow, and an architect. And somewhere in a remote northern facility, far from Moscow's noise, a man named Mark Ellery sat alone in a windowless room, waiting for the next set of instructions. Because the Cold War never ended for men like him. It merely changed walls.